Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, human heated planet, still a pandemic wrapped planet. It doesn't feel like that in some places, but it's percolating and simmering as long as there's still several billion people who are not fully vaccinated. That's the case. It's turbulent. There's been this week, as always, there have been a number of developments related to climate change, related to the vulnerability we have to climate impacts, even in today's climate. We're going to talk about wildfires. We're going to talk about ice falls and deadly avalanches, like the one that just happened in on Marmolada, the tallest mountain in the Italian Dolomites, the Italian Alps. And I have a baby. I'm babysitting a dog here that is whining. So, hey Dale, you want to say hi too, while I give the dogs a treat?
Yes. Good afternoon, everybody.
So
Good day.
funny.
I'm Dale Willman from the Columbia Climate School, and I work with journalists, training journalists about resilience and resilience issues. So Andy and I have been doing these Friday events for a couple of months now.
And the dogs have their treats, so hopefully you won't hear that amazing whining. Yeah, I didn't mention I'm Andy Revkin, so 35 years on the beat, and it's been a busy time, and I've got some great guests. Jeremy Moore from Colorado. It's Rocky Mountain PBS. You can unmute.
Rocky Mountain PBS.
And you're based in Denver, Boulder, where?
Denver.
And you've done a film on this 6 months in, the Marshall Fire, which I wrote 3 or 4 pieces about, and devastated 1,000 homes, burned when a insanely intense wind-driven grassland fire became an urban inferno. And the communities in Colorado are struggling with the real-time pressures of economic sustainability and the long-term reality that they have to be fire safe. And this film really captures some of that. And also with us is Fabian Beau, who studies glacial morphology, glacial dynamics. And we'll talk about what happened in Italy and how actually there's research showing these. This was seen as kind of a relic glacier. I've been up in the Alps. I wrote a piece in 1995 for Condé Nast Traveler on the vanishing ice in the Alps, the Aletsch and other glaciers. And a lot of them are just sort of shriveled away, and you don't think of them as dangerous. But kaboom, this one showed that that's not the case. So we'll talk about all that. I'm going to go through a couple of little tidbits from the news that caught my eye and that I reported on to some extent. And I use Twitter as kind of a little bit of a way to get through this. One of these, some of you may have seen that the Declare Emergency, which is a tiny little cluster, kind of an Extinction Rebellion style climate activist group based largely in DC. Did you eat that already? I think so. They staged what's become kind of a tactic of the day, shutdown of a highway, I-495, the inner belt of it around Washington, D.C., to make their case to the Biden administration to declare a climate emergency. And I have a lot of issues in the way that played out, even if it hadn't done what it did, which is a young man who had to get to his work, who's a parolee, and made a very cogent argument to them that he needed to open one lane. Have your
Andy, you're dropping out there. So what he was talking about until he comes back is that the parolee was politely asking him to open one lane, just to let a few cars by so he could get to his job, not lose his job and risk going back into prison because he wanted to take care of his son. And there was an absolutist nature to the protest, and they were still there saying he could not leave. So eventually he got arrested, pretty angrily arrested, and charged with, I forget the charge, but the leader of the group said, oh, he didn't hit me, he didn't touch me, he's innocent, but nonetheless the damage was done. So it was a pretty severe instance of absolutism, and I think I hear you back maybe, Andy?
I think so. If Dale didn't explain, I'm in rural Maine, and like the digital divide is real. I have Starlink, the system that's helping Ukraine fight the Russians, Elon Musk's satellite internet. And there's a cluster of low-flying satellites up there, but we have too many trees. So we don't have a good view of the sky. So every 20 minutes or so, there's a freeze up. And that, to me, indicates two things. The value of what we're trying to do by getting everybody connected and what I have is already still fantastic, but it's insufficient. So sorry about the glitch there. If that happens again, you guys just keep talking. Let's see if this will play. It's going to show Fox had on one of the activists. I'm not sure if you're seeing this.
I do not see it.
You're not seeing it? Yeah, I just screwed up. Well, they had on
The dog is apparently not a Fox fan.
Yeah, Dale, why don't you kind of take over here for a minute while I don't want to impede the flow, and we could just get through some of this. Sorry.
I don't know what other weekly stories you have up, but yeah,
I'll go through them. And all right. So let's just talk a little bit initially. Just do a round of introductions. Flavien, what drove you to get into glacier science?
Oh, that's a good question. Really, I love mountains, and I love spending time in the mountains, skiing, mountain biking, hiking, climbing, just whatever. And I was always very curious, and I love skiing. I grew up in the Alps in France and Switzerland, and I love skiing steep mountains. And I wanted to understand why some mountains were steep and not others. And it turns out that glaciers are a big part of that answer. And so, studying glaciers was also a good way to have an excuse to go spend some time in the mountains for work.
So when I did that piece in 1995, I was at the Aletsch Glacier, which is in the French, right on the French part of the Alps. And even then, 1995, Art Furrer, who ran the resort, who was approaching 80 years old, he had seen all these changes in the Alps. He was already transitioning them from winter sports to summer. Okay. And it seems to me that what just happened in Italy sort of is a foreplay of the risks that come with more summer activity on these mountains. Certainly, I think the risk of avalanches of this kind, as opposed to snow avalanches, are probably higher in the summer. Italy just had the extreme heat.
I mean, I'm not going to say for that specific one what the cause is and whether it was triggered by the heat or not, because it's likely that it was, but also it could have just fell off by itself. Because that's one thing that, to start with, is like glaciers move, and that's something that is easy to not know or to forget about. But glaciers, move because the ice is actually a fluid, and it creeps a little bit like honey on a toast. And then some glaciers also slide at their bed. And so all of the sliding part is what we talk about when we think of ice sheet collapse, when we think of like these bigger Greenland glaciers and how they contribute to sea level rise. That's a big part of it. But for these glaciers, especially that small pocket of ice, basically, it doesn't necessarily slide all that much, and it mostly creeps. But what that means is that eventually, if it creeps over a cliff, it can break. And then what triggers that is I think that's still to be determined. It's likely that it played a role, I think I guess it's the same for a lot of things, and it's a bit of a common theme. But we have to adapt. The change is here. And so it's not necessarily that there's more or less hazards, because maybe there's going to be less avalanche, like snow avalanche hazard, because there's going to be less snow. But that means that we're just shifting the hazards. There was several years ago, I think there was the last big heat wave in Europe. It was in the mid 2000s, I believe. And the access to the Matterhorn, so the Cervin in Switzerland, was closed. So the Matterhorn is the Toblerone mountain for those who, and the access was closed for like weeks because there was the permafrost was melting and there was a lot of rockfalls. So it's we're gonna have to adapt for sure, and this is a bit of a wake up call in the sense of what kind of hazards we might be looking at.
Yeah, it sure is. And this gets us into the fire arena.
Yep, we're back.
Uh,
No dog, but no Andy.
yeah.
Are you there, Andy?
Yeah, I'm back.
Okay,
I
you're
think.
back.
Dale, you might have
Yep.
to kind of just take this over as just a conversation with folks. I did send you a link to the video of
Right.
the
I
Fox
have
one,
that up.
but let me also send you the link to Jeremy's film, just in case I get hung up again. So why don't you? So let's just go. I was just talking about the fire issue, Jeremy. You know, the story there is so much about vulnerability, along with change. You know, there's complicated dynamics in the weather around Boulder. You know, it's famous for these downslope winds. The grassland there is like tinder. So you get heat, you get drought, you have these conditions, some of which would be there with or without climate change. But then you have communities, as Stephen Pine, the Arizona fire historian, put it to me. He said they're basically building a forest. Like Superior, Colorado, the way it was built was essentially a forest's worth of wood. It just was reassembled into these homes in Sagamore and other communities that were really vulnerable. So, Jeremy, can you just talk about that, how that played out, and how you in the film you did? I'm going to send the link to my colleague Dale just so he can show a little bit of it.
Sure. It's I think one of my biggest takeaways from working on this project is the fact that no one's safe from wildland fires now. And typically when you build in Colorado, you'll have open spaces. We really value our open spaces. So a lot of communities are built next to these grasslands. And a lot of the people I talked to, a lot of the families that lost their homes, didn't think this could happen. Thought they were safe from wildland fires, especially when you have this giant 6-lane highway separating you from flames. But it with winds 80 to 90 miles an hour, that the 6-lane highway means nothing. I mean, fire breaks don't really mean anything anymore. And typically, I mean, from the decades of news coverage that I've worked through in terms of wildfires and grassland fires in Colorado, I'd say the grassland fires were put out pretty quickly in comparison to the fires in the foothills or in the mountains. So I think a lot of attention was put on wildfires at higher elevations, and less so on the grassland fires. But the Marshall Fire was, of course, a grassland fire that just with those winds, and it's crazy that this happened in December, December 30th, when you would think there'd be snow in Colorado to slow fires like this down. But yeah, a lot of the experts didn't think, even climate people that are kind of immersed in climate science, they weren't necessarily surprised this happened, but they weren't paying attention as much as they thought they should have. And now they're pretty sure this is going to happen more often. So the piece that I did was more on people trying to rebuild buildings that are more resilient to these events. So I delved into passive house standards for home construction, and kind of focused on fire victims who wanted to rebuild to passive house standards, even though labor, materials, everything's way more expensive now. But we have some unprecedented incentives here in Colorado, especially for marshal fire victims, to rebuild high performance homes that are almost as a benefit that you didn't intend in the first place, that are more fire resistant, just because they're usually simpler shape. So there's fewer little nooks and crannies for small fires to start. And they have insulation that is treated with fire resistant materials. And there are fewer places for fires to enter homes because you have high quality windows, triple pane windows that are not going to fail with strong heat. I tried to focus on people who want to build back better and take advantage of incentives, and then take advantage of long-term cost savings. And the gentleman you're seeing now, Andrew Mitchler, is the guy that kind of got this all rolling. He's talking here about how simplified designs of buildings will improve fire resilience. So yeah, the focus the focus of my show was just to try to get fire victims to rebuild better, because they're making those decisions right now.
Yeah, and that I like that concept, because it's also really important in an accountability way to do the negative. I do a lot of finger pointing in my journalism too, like, why the heck is Superior Colorado's board? Why did they vote down wildfire codes? Part of that dynamic is because people aren't necessarily fully aware of the work of like Headwaters Economics and Mitchell and others. That many times home design, at least for new homes, that's fire safe or the fire resistant, fire safer, isn't more expensive, and it gives you the added benefit. Right now, Paradise, California, just adopted the IBHS code, which is a new code for wildfire resistance, even as Superior was going in the opposite direction. But I like this to me also has great value, because it's kind of saying, you can do this. There can be a different norm where it isn't seen like an obligation or a restriction. Something about the dynamic in the West particularly gets into this debate over, you're trying to restrict my capacity to build the way I want to. I don't know if that feels resonant.
I think a lot of the resistance to this standard of building is coming from, fossil fuel industries and from traditional home builders, because they haven't done it before. They don't want to learn how to do it. But and there's a steep learning curve. But I talked to a lot of folks who thought, after an event like the Marshall Fire, we could develop maybe like a task force or a strike force of passive house designers and experts who could go to communities that are destroyed, like Superior and Louisville, and just kind of really flood that community with knowledge of how to do this and how to do it cheaply, and having methodologies that could be repeated very easily once people got over the hump of learning and the initial pain of learning these new techniques that have been around since the 70s, that just haven't taken off because energy has been so cheap, but now it's not. So and these climate disasters are coming faster, and we just need to build for the future. We need to build better now.
Yeah, and how is that the federal infrastructure money also flowing in there?
Yes, FEMA is here, and even the private sector stepping in. I mean, XL Energy is offering $37,500 to Marshall Fire victims if they reach the passive house standard, and that's never happened before, and that's quite a large investment from them.
Wow.
Yeah, I think that if I may, like, I think it's really interesting because that's the way forward. Like, whatever issue we talk about, like whether it's fires, whether it's flood, whether it's other hazards, it's like building better, and understanding like we see here, like in Vancouver, like the fires in the city are not necessarily an issue, but there's a lot of wildfires around, and the floods in November cut the city from the rest of Canada for a bit, and that's why like a lot of communities on places where they just shouldn't be. A lot of the dikes are there but not maintained. A lot of the things like that, and so it's if we don't build better, it's not going to change. Like it's just going to hit repeat just 10 years, 15 years from now.
Yeah.
And I think yeah, it's great to see like that kind of things moving forward, these kind of initiatives.
And one of the things that drives me crazy is there's a huge opportunity to for community to community sharing of knowledge. In California, there were these terrible fires in the wine country that were very similar to what happened in Boulder County, where a
Another satellite pass.
urban.
While he's frozen there, let me jump if I could, Jeremy. There's a couple of things I wanted to ask about. One is I want to return to the idea of building codes, because building codes traditionally, people think of them as a high standard, but they're the floor. They're not a high standard. And to change building codes is a draconian process that often takes 20, 30 years to get anything through. A quick anecdote: 15 years ago, I live in upstate New York near the Adirondacks. I was talking to a realtor. We started talking about greenhouses. He said he was a proponent, but he really couldn't do it. I said, look, there's a 10% premium to build a greenhouse. It costs about 10% more. It's not as much as everybody thinks, but you can sell it for a 25% premium. So if all you're about is making money, you'll make more money if you build green homes. 15 years later, he hasn't built one because of the inertia in place that this is working, this is how I'm going to do it. And that pressure translates onto the planning boards that won't allow stronger codes to come into place. And there's an equity issue too, because that can hurt people without means. And the people in your video were at least middle class, if not upper middle class. How do people of lesser means afford a home that could save their lives? It's complicated. Sorry, there's a lot of questions in there, but it's a complicated issue, and it's an important one to have this conversation about, because how do we include equity in this equation and include guidelines that say you have to start thinking and taking these concepts into play?
So I'm actually working on a new project through with the help of Boulder County. They were beta testing a map that layered data on top of to try to equitably respond to natural disasters. And then the Marshall Fire came, and the firm working on this map said, or the Boulder County asked the firm working on this map to switch gears. Let's use this map that we're developing to respond to the Marshall Fire. So they mapped every address that had an impact from the fire and the wind event, because it was a dramatic wind event as well. So the victims of that day that we haven't really heard from or heard about are the wind victims who lost roofs in mobile home parks, had their power shut off, had nothing to keep them warm, just wrapped themselves in blankets. Then their homes flooded because their pipes froze. So the project I'm working on now is what Boulder County calls the equity map, and they're trying to respond with the resources from that day that they're getting in terms of emergency response to the people that need it the most. And I've been interviewing folks who don't speak English in mobile home parks in Boulder County who have gotten very little help because they don't have the networks that can start a GoFundMe page for them, and help them rebuild that way. But yeah, in terms of building codes, I heard from the mayor of Louisville that had adopted the international building codes just months before the fire. And then a lot of residents after the fire said, "Why are you making us pay more to rebuild?" And even environmentalists spoke out against the codes. Um, so I guess the result of that was you can opt out in Louisville. You can opt out of the codes, but then you miss out on all the incentives. You miss out on the long-term cost savings. And you're right, the codes are the bare minimum. I mean, building a code home is just the bare minimum, and you're going to have to retrofit it probably in a few years. And I think a lot of the building codes are making the home ready to hook up to solar, making the home ready to charge a car in the garage. They're very common sense, and I was hearing that not hooking up natural gas could be cheaper. I mean, there are a lot of common sense benefits if people would just think about it of building better. And a community that has better built homes protects itself. I mean, it's a domino effect. When a fire comes through, it'll burn one house and then the next one. So it's kind of like the pandemic. You protect yourself by getting vaccinated. It's like you build a home that's more fire resistant, you're protecting your neighbors, and then the more neighbors that do that, you're protecting the whole community. So yeah, it just makes building codes the bare minimum, but we really ought to be going way beyond the building codes, and they're getting way more attention than they should because they're just the bare minimum.
And there's a scale here that gets Flavian back into the mix also, which is not just structural design, but community design, and where we build and where we don't build. Again, Headwaters Economics has done incredible work. They're based in Bozeman, I think, but for more than a decade I've been looking at their approach, which they try to facilitate with partners community integrating sort of fire ecology into their planning, their long-term plans. Where the forests are, just as Flavian, where the steep slopes are, where the landslide or avalanche risk is, and some of this is about geography, about mapping, about conveying that story to people so that they understand the threat.
Yeah, I think that. So one of the big thing that struck. So I grew up in France, and I went to university in Switzerland before coming to Vancouver for my PhD already, and then I lived in California, in Los Angeles, pretty much for 2 years before coming back again. And it's like throughout my studies, like I had some classes about natural hazards in Switzerland and things like that. And what it comes out is that there are hazard maps, and the hazard maps are public, and there are building codes that match the hazard maps. So there are zones where you can't build. There are zones where you can build, but you have to have certain structures in place, and so on. So it depends a little bit from the general building code, but I think it's kind of all related to. And one thing that struck me is that in North America in general, these hazard maps don't necessarily exist. And I was living in LA when there was the big Malibu fire, and I remember seeing it, burning at night from LA. And you have all these fancy houses from really wealthy people that they shouldn't be there when you think of it in terms of hazard. And California is a lot like that. And so and what I understood, and I might be wrong, but that's my is that these hazard maps exist. But there are some insurance company or there are some developers that keep them somewhat private. And so they exist, but no one has access to them because it would prevent development. And so if people understood the environment they live in, I think that would go a long way in helping understand the building code that are necessary. And yeah, I know for a lot of people it's hard to plan for more than 5 years. That's just how the human mind works. But and that's where it's yeah, it's like without government or like at least state incentive, it's really hard to like have these things. I know my understanding in British Columbia here is that there's not necessarily hazard maps for the province, but there are communities that have their hazard maps. So it depends on basically who's proactive and who's not. And then there might be the flooding one, but there's no avalanche one. Or it's always, and the density of population is also a lot less than in Europe in general. So I think that's part of the reason. But still, there are people living in places that are difficult. I remember, when was it? Like 10 years ago, a bit less than that. There was a big landslide in Washington State that destroyed like a dozen of houses. And when you looked at the map, even just the satellite images, you could see that they had built on a landslide deposit. And so it's yeah, like, but people, there's not necessarily a lot of built health history, especially in the West, and so people don't really have these things. And I mean, even in Switzerland, like even if there is that built history, people still ignore it, and like there's a lot of issues there for different reasons. But generally, yeah, like if people like sharing what's around us and like what are the actual hazards that we have to face, and that being made public would go a very long way.
Oh yeah, this business of proprietary data is a good story. I'm sure Jeremy, there are many people who are digging in. Data-driven journalism is a big part of journalism going forward, I think, and there are untapped possibilities. Some are like there are outliers like ProPublica who are sort of normalizing that form of journalism. But and I'm showing, by the way, FEMA has risk maps, hazard maps, vulnerability maps, but they're not accessible, as you say, to the average person. You have to really know where these things are, and that gets to the equity issue again, where if you have a marginal or no internet connection, it's even harder. Or if you just
Can I jump in and ask a quick process question on this?
Hmm.
With all the changes from what's happening with, climate change is advancing faster than the original models had predicted. How is that changing the hazard maps? Is that creating a problem can you rely on hazard maps if they're going to change over the next 20 years because of shifts with climate?
Yes and no. It's like it in the sense that they give a good general idea of what's going to change. It's like if something is somewhere, it's probably still going to be there. But one thing that's coming out with a lot of the floods in BC is that the style of event is changing, and so what was set up as the way floods are qualified is by recurrence interval. So basically, it's the statistical measure of how often you expect an event, and hazards are qualified like that in general. So basically, if you expect something to come back every 10 years, that really should be completely not even bother people. If it's every 50 years, they might it should still be very well built for. And if it's every 100 years or 200 years, that sounds to be on the edge of what the infrastructure is built to withstand. That's the general idea. And so what's happening is that the amplitude of the floods for the same return time is getting bigger. And so whatever infrastructure was built 30 years ago, 40 years ago for a 50, 100 years return flood, like maybe now what was built for 100 years, maybe now is actually valid only for the 50 years. And I'm using a gross example, but that's the general idea. And so it's not necessarily that things are completely changing. It's just things are just getting a bit worse.
And just to make clear, I wasn't implying that hazard maps are not of value. They're of huge, immense value. But what I hear you saying is that just the intensity is what's changing. So we already know those hazards are. We have to account for the increase in intensity.
More or less.
Although again, as Flavien said, this unfortunately discrete events, tornadoes, flash floods. Flash floods particularly are very hard to predict. The one that hit New York City area was just one of those extreme events that you can't even get to a risk. They don't get into a risk model because they're so rare, even with what we know about climate change. What I'm showing here is the work of Stephen Strader and Walker Ashley, which I find incredibly informative because it's saying that risk is a function of the hazard and exposure, meaning how many things or people are in the way. And those things are changing way faster than climate is changing. And they've done, this is one of their great schematics that shows this is an imaginary floodplain and an imaginary community from 1950 through 2040. And you can see density of both development and population growing into the floodplain faster than any dynamic within the floodplain is changing the floods. And that leads me back to Jeremy's work, which is there's tons you can do when you know that, and you get less focused on climate change and more focused on climate risk and climate risk reduction, you can really start to work with the landscape of hazard and get the exposure, shape it out of the way, and the vulnerability, which is the equity issue, can be totally worked on. While we work on decarbonizing and slowing global warming, this is the work that is there urgently in every community, whether it's fire, flood, you name it. And I've been trying to drive this forward as much as I can, because it gets also around the doomism, which is, oh, you know, we got to slow global warming. That's going to take decades. Sorry, climate emergency folks. It's going to take decades, period. It's not because I'm a denier. That's because I know it's the reality. So but that doesn't mean you don't do anything. You can cut vulnerability right now, especially the inequity, the deep pockets of vulnerability. And that to me is a story. I'd love to see a map like that, you know, for every community. The data are there mostly just to show you growth in zones of hazard, and worry less about incremental tweaks in the hazard itself, meaning the storm or the flood. I don't know if that makes sense.
So the civil engineers I interviewed for the equity map piece I'm working on, they say mapping, I mean, we have the technology now to just lay data on maps whenever we want. I mean, and the user experience is like Google Maps or, you know, Apple Maps. You just, you know, hover over it and it tells you all this data, you know, and you pick which data you want. I mean, I'm sure you could do that with hazard maps with data from NOAA or, you know, some agency like that.
And by the way, that also means the agencies have to talk to each other. And I've tried to do some sessions on here about that. The disciplines, geographers, like Steve Strader, who pioneered this mapping. I was at a volcano. I was running a session on volcanoes and danger, and classic instance where people love volcanoes because of the soil, because of the scenic value, and they hate them when they blow up. And they did some mapping showing in Seattle, this actually the huge development on the flanks of those still living volcanoes is creating deep vulnerability that no one thinks about until the next time there's a surprise. And I tried to get him to weigh in on kind of the communication part, and he said, "I'm an academic. I don't really do that." And that's why I like people like Flavian, who I've met on Twitter, because they have expertise. They're there, available to journalists or the public when a glacier has collapsed in the Alps or in all these other instances. So encouraging interfaces between expertise and journalists and communities seems like another way forward. I don't know if that makes sense. Dale, that's a big part of what you're trying to do with the Resilience Media Project.
It's important. It's an accountability
Hopefully
issue. When journalists, yeah, you were still there. When journalists are a part of that conversation, then it becomes that there's a high level of accountability. There's also the issue of training for journalists who, I would imagine, Jeremy, you may not have been steeped in building codes and insurance and all these other things that you're now probably a bit of an expert on because you had to cover this stuff. So providing that sort of training for journalists and for city administrators who are often, you know, citizens who do this as a part-time thing. and don't have that knowledge set. So that sort of training, I think, is critically important to get communities talking in that sense. So when you have the public, decision makers, business leaders, and journalists together to have this conversation, which is something that Rocky Mountain Public Broadcasting can foster. You could have these events in your studios and broadcast them, and I think that would be an amazing service for the community to have this broader conversation. And it doesn't take a lot of resources to pull it together, but what it does is it gets people talking to each other instead of yelling at each other. So I think
By
there's
the
an
way,
immense value in that.
I'm showing Flavian's Twitter flow, which is actually directly addressing this right here by retweeting Life After My PhD. I'm not sure who that is, but here's an infographic on this interface between expertise and the industry.
Yeah, and that's the something that I'm striving towards. I'm not sure if I'm doing it yet, but I've been in different departments. I've been in geography departments, earth science, geology, environmental science, and now I'm I have a big foot in a consulting company, and that's probably where my future is going to be, because academia is anyways, I can't live in Vancouver and keep on staying in academia. But one of the things is how difficult it is to share all these things. And as an academic, there's so little incentive to do so. And the people who do so have to go against the flow to do it, because it's slowly changing. But basically, any sort of media outreach, any sort of outreach in general, is not a quantifiable or is not a metric that's valued
Right.
for the academic advancement. And so it's kind of difficult, because basically the people who do that are taking on to themselves and risk to some extent some aspect of their career to do so, which is absolutely backwards. And then and yeah, so I'm thankful for the opportunity to share, because I think it's really important. We need to have a stream of communication across the different people, the journalists, the public, the media, the scientists, so that we can understand these things together. Because the one thing that was very interesting and that keeps on being reminded is how people have different views and perceptions and interest into these hazards. And a joke in earth sciences often is whenever there's a big hazard that happens, a lot of people obviously sad or affected by what happened, but people get really excited and they want to understand what happened.
Right.
And there's a lot of you can see the Twitter feed around the Marmolada Glacier collapse. A lot of people are just using their expertise to produce an image, to produce a volume, to produce some sort of better understanding. And that's where it gets a little bit tricky too, because on one hand, you have excited academics that are sharing these pieces of knowledge that are very valid and important to share, but also that need context. And then so how do you turn from these excited academics to something that a journalist can actually share that's relevant information, and not just an excitement about something, because it's really easy to jump to conclusions when maybe it's a bit too soon to jump to conclusion, but then it's a good opportunity to explain why we can't do that. I think that's I'm trying to see how that fits better in.
Well, to me, that's kind of that's the mission of the initiative I've been working on with Dan for the last 3 years, which is to get people in the different compartments and components of expertise, knowledge, data, and the public sphere. What are the components of that that can drive decision making or drive behavior in ways that can create a world that's more resilient, more equitable, more inquiry-based, and less about the moment. Jeremy, Dale, and I are in journalism. The big fight is, how do you change the definition of success? If it's just clicks, then that drives us in exactly the wrong direction from what Flavian was just describing, which is, wait a minute, we don't know whether someone made a mistake by not warning people to get off the mountain.
Yeah.
And this happened in Italy when scientists were prosecuted for failing to warn about an earthquake.
The earthquake, yeah.
L'Aquila. And it took 6 years for them to be finally the last one. The charges have been modified.
And that is so wrong.
Oh, yeah. You know,
that is so like, and yeah, it's interesting that like I think media and academia it's facing the same problem in a way, is that like I guess in the media the number of clicks or the number of views or the number of is turning into the metric, and in academia is the number of papers published.
yeah.
And there's actually some studies that came out showing that the sheer volume produced is detrimental to advancing science, because it just like some big media outlets, like same with the scientists, some famous scientists will have a bigger voice, the rest will be drowned. It doesn't mean they're better, it just means they have more visibility. And so long as visibility is the metric, then it's not necessarily moving quite in the right direction. And one thing I was thinking is,
I would love to see that paper, by the way.
Oh yeah, I can find it and share it.
Yeah.
It's one thing that I was thinking, when in the flow, maybe I'm digressing a little bit, but because I started my PhD or like my research career just before the internet where it was really easy to just access papers all the time. So I still had to go in libraries and copy papers on journals, on books. And I think like in a few decades ago, it was hard to find the information. But once you found it, it was possibly like very, like somewhat reasonable. Whereas now the problem is flipped, where we're bombarded with information. And the challenge is not to find it, it's to sort through it. And I like, even in research, like you'd think in academia, people would know better, but no, like they're humans. And so it's an interesting switch, I think.
It's a systems problem, like sustainability itself.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some postdocs at Columbia who wrote a paper for Nature Sustainability a year or so ago that we held this discussion on, which is what can be done in academia to change both the incentives and especially incentives that can let early career scientists particularly do what needs to be done when you face systems issue, which is interdisciplinarity, community-based
Mm-hmm.
research. What is required to do interdisciplinary research or community-based research? Time.
Yeah.
So those papers take more time.
And it's like for me, like, not that I regret doing it or anything, but the experiment that I was showing, like the video that I did during, it was my first postdoc that I did at Caltech. It took 2 years to design and build, and it's a really awesome experiment that I'm looking forward to like put the results out. But I finished the experiments 2 weeks before the end of my postdoc and moving back to Vancouver. And I haven't, for different reasons, and it was in 2019. But the thing is, 2 years without publishing papers because I was just working on one big experiment in terms of scientific career is actually detrimental to my career. And so we don't have the flexibility of working on big projects. And I guess in the media, it's the same, because you need to be productive. You need to get...
Yeah, it's absolutely the same.
And it's a little bit unfortunate.
Yeah. Well, this gets to the reality that even here we're summarizing the week's news, but I think it's valuable that we've gotten into the core questions behind the week's news. This isn't just about a glacier that slipped. This isn't just about a community that's challenged and trying to find resilient ways to build. This isn't just about climate emergency demonstrations causing
No.
a guy to lose his job. It's about the systemic questions behind them and finding ways to address them too. What you just said about this work is really interesting. What was the result? So this is what I also loved about this was it's a physical model.
Yeah.
We're all so virtual these days. So tell us why you had to do a physical model and where is that going?
Oh, yeah. So it's very interesting. It's not what I planned to do during that postdoc. I was planning to do other things, but it turned out that what I was planning to do maybe was not all that interesting, or like we kind of had enough pieces of the answer. And so with my supervisor, then I'm interested in glacial dynamics in general, and a lot of it has to do with the water that flows under glaciers and how the water flows. And we have some theories, we have some numerical models, but we know they're kind of wrong. And part of the reason they're wrong is that it's a difficult problem. It's like heat exchange between a moving fluid, which is water, and the ice. And so there's a lot of complicated processes at play. And the idea was trying to, could we basically mimic the water flow under glaciers in the lab? And so that's what we tried to do. And so what we designed was an ice flume, basically, and the reason why you see so much insulation is because it's basically just in a building at Caltech, and there's no cooling in that building. And that was filmed in August in Los Angeles, so the ice needed some insulation. And so we bought a big chiller, basically same idea as ice rink. You have a big chiller that recirculates a coolant at minus 12, 13 degrees Celsius. I'm not sure what that is in Fahrenheit, and I can't. But so really cold fluid, and then we spray water on it. So very much like building an ice rink, but we build that in the flume. And then we had that block of ice that was about 3 meters long and 30 centimeters across, so about a foot across and 10 feet long. And the other thing that we did is like we wanted to understand how the melting was evolving. So instead of typically you have the ice sitting on top of the bed, but here we flipped the problem around so that we could build the ice easily, and then we put a lid on it, and the lid had plastic beads that were basically gravel to mimic what's at the bed of the glacier. And the lid, like you see it like move on here, and like I would clamp on it to seal, and then water would flow from the right of the screen, from the box you see, into the experiment and flow out to the other side and melt the ice. And so we could document how water melts ice, and how that melt is affected by the roughness of the lid, and so on. And so basically we have so little data on how water melts ice, and we know that the current theories are wrong. So that's kind of the where we're getting at. Is like with that experiments, we can actually show that how wrong the current theories are, and propose some new ideas about how to move forward, and why the theories are wrong too, which is going to be extremely useful. But yeah, I'm still sitting on it, and I'm hoping that some of it will come out soon.
And I assume some of that would then inform the numerical models too in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. So and it was not the plan, but I think one of the big outcome of it is that right now one of the big question is how much ocean water melts ice in Antarctica and in Greenland and things like that. And
Right.
there we clearly see that the melt that's observed goes a lot faster than the predictions. And basically, by going down to the processes, we can start finding some reason as to why that happens, and what needs to be changed, or like what needs to be monitored to better understand how much melt is happening.
Yeah,
So-
well, so this is great. Well, the more, the better. At Columbia, there's a big project underway that's how to use artificial intelligence to improve climate models. But I think this is important as well, to just get at this sort of the scale of features that you can't really do
Right.
the numbers. There are too many
And-
parameterizations. The
Yeah,
weak spots.
exactly.
So we're toward the end here. I didn't notice there are a bunch of questions, some good questions that have come in here. So let me just flip the screen this way so we can see them. And thank you all for being here today. And sorry, I apologize for my bandwidth issues and dog whining issues. There's a big one that, Dale, I'm going to hold off on because it's for you. It's about resilience, and we could do a whole nother session on that from Edward Ed Ablard. But he also says,
I've always written down his name.
Yeah, this one is, what are some of the elements of passive housing that could help survive a marshal fire? Now, Jeremy, you did mention, surfaces that don't have a lot of openings. I didn't know if there's anything else that beyond what you had already described that comes to mind.
Well, I think in general they have simple shapes, which reduces the compliance with fire. It doesn't give it a lot of places to start small fires, which kind of like kindling will start the whole place. They also use triple pane windows, which are windows are often how wildfires get into homes, and because they fail when there's heat on them. For traditional windows fail pretty easily when a wildfire comes through, but the triple pane windows can withstand that kind of heat often. There's just the material in general. Metal and like fire resistant materials behind the metal, and strategically placed areas.
The guy at the end mentioned, I forget what it's called, hardy board or something. I hadn't heard the name before, but it's a concrete sort of structure.
Yeah, concrete. There's concrete siding.
But it looks like wood. I mean, it doesn't.
Yeah.
When you say concrete, you think, oh, it's going to look like a federal government building, but it doesn't. It looks good.
Yeah, and then a lot of these buildings have rain catchment for the water inside the home. So that's a metal roof. And Andrew Mitchler could really. He probably has all kinds of links on his website to why because his background is his family home was burned in a wildfire in Oakland, California, before he moved to Colorado. So designing his first passive house project above Masonville, which is west of Fort Collins and Loveland, he was thinking about fire resistance when he was designing that. So.
But Jeremy, the guy who really blew me away watching that was the guy, I don't know if he was on the cul-de-sac or what, but several houses around him had burned to some extent, but not completely. But the stench and everything, he went back in home because he has such a strong filtration system. He smelled no smoke. His air was fine. And anybody who's been around a fire like that knows it takes weeks for that if you're lucky, for that stench, that damp smoke smell to begin to dissipate. So that was sort of the proof of this, is what he was talking about and what it meant for him.
Right. Yeah. Because passive homes are an airtight envelope, you don't get any of the smoke inside damaging absolutely everything down to the walls that you have to rip out. And then they have
you're still exchanging with outside air.
Right. But you have a filtration system that makes that, and an energy exchange to improve the temperature inside. But yeah, it's airtight, and then you have fresh air constantly that's being filtered.
This is one of the homes in the neighborhood in Superior that did not burn. There was homes that were just 2 years old or so. I found on Twitter, actually, I met Noah Abrams, interviewed him. This is just a couple of days after the fire, and they were kind of marveling at that those houses did not burn, even when the ones upwind of them did. There were several. The firefighting was involved too, but he has that siding that we're just talking about, and yeah, it looks like wood. It's not like a bunker. And here were details.
That reminds me, Andy, of the guy you wrote about, the house after the hurricane down in was it Louisiana or Florida, with the devastation around him. The one house standing there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, the ones on stills. And here a couple of examples of features of those houses that limited their the loss. We're sort of at the end. If we can go a couple of minutes late, that's fine for me. If it's okay with you guys. And I'm sorry, today's panel is all male. I try as much as I can to make things diverse. Jonathan Vai, who's a climate scientist who was right there on the front line. His house was in Sagamore on that, looking out. This is a picture he took as this 90-mile-an-hour wind was coming. No one really knew what it was yet, and it was coming. His house was destroyed. But I wanted to show one thing he had in this PowerPoint presentation. Let's see if I can get to it, which is about the grasses. Oh yeah, there's a good picture of that highway barrier that Jeremy was talking about, or one of them. It shows you that can lull you into a sense of safety. But the other thing he mentioned was the grasses, and this is an issue that could have and should have been dealt with. For ecological reasons, they weren't mowing those grasses right up near to the fence line for the property, and there were also tumbleweed that had accumulated and created a kind of a firebomb. And here we go. And he said that these issues too are there. That's like a classic kind of competing priorities question, aesthetics and ecological work versus resilience. So there's a lot to do there. And so we can call it quits. I'd love to revisit some of these questions. And I'm assuming I'm being heard. But this has been I think what this session illustrates to me over and over again is that there are deep systemic challenges behind the news events that we focus on each week. And the question is, how can we build tools or practices for everyone involved in this question, whether it's a homeowner, a board of trustee member, a president, a firefighter, what a teacher, what are the ways to use communication, particularly communication tools, whether mapping or more use of Twitter, that can get us on trajectories toward better outcomes. So keep that in mind. And Jeremy, as you do your next story, we can revisit. Flavien, I'd love to get back at you. Maybe we'll revisit some of those postdocs to talk about the challenges of young researchers generally. And we'll go forward. And obviously we can talk more and more about resilience, Dale, always. And so maybe we'll just call it a wrap. If you can stay on for another minute or two, I think we'll try to play that last video that illustrates another challenge we have in the media and in the environmental movement. Hopefully this will work. I think I've got it set up so you can actually hear it.
And just to remind, that's the one that's in relation to the climate activism on 495 around DC, right? And
yeah,
Fox News is interviewing one of the participants.
I just wrote a story about this, so hopefully this will work. Let's see. So the activists got their dream. They got on Fox. I'm not going to play
the climate activists who shut down highways so you can't get to work. Join me next.
Yo, I'm about to get locked up for 54 years of my parole if I don't make my job. And y'all are so inconsiderate. 495. Yo.
Well, traffic is bad enough, but it's even worse when climate activists decide to block a busy highway. That's exactly what happened on July 4th in the DC Beltway, one of the area's busiest roadways, for nearly 2 hours. It caused total chaos, but especially for this guy who was out on parole.
Yo, I'm about to get locked up for 54 years of my parole if I don't make my job. And y'all are so inconsiderate. 495. Yo, please. We're live streaming right now.
Opportunity. You made the guy late to work. He's on parole. He's probably going to get sent back to prison. Would you like to just apologize to him?
What I would like to do actually is just acknowledge that we do disrupt people's lives. And it's really not any different than the disruption that one would expect. For example, at 2 o'clock in the morning in bed when a fire alarm goes off.
The dog is yowling again. I do encourage folks to watch the whole episode. It's just 2 or 3 minutes. And on Twitter at Revkin, you can reply whether you think this was a success for this group, declare emergency, or a failure. It's to me an utter tragedy that we're locked into, where again the edges of the argument dominate the media sphere, unfortunately, and what that misses is paths forward. When I wrote about it, I wrote, the guy, all he kept doing was asking for one lane. He said, just give me one lane. I got to get to work and avoid getting fired, going back to jail so I can take care of my kid. And they were oblivious. They just sat there. And I just find that to be completely and utterly not only unethical and immoral and dangerous but also counterproductive if their goal is to stop the climate emergency. But that's just me. So thank you again for being here. Hopefully we can make media that work better and get conversations around these issues that are not exactly like what you see too often on talk TV. This is Andy Revkin, Columbia Climate School. I'm no longer on Lenape territory. I'm on Penobscot territory up here in Maine. And grateful for the landscape around me. And I hope you all can share this when we're done. It gets archived, whatever you're watching on, it's archived there to share later. Jeremy Moore from Rocky Mountain Public Broadcasting, thank you. Flavian, Bo, thank you for your insights. Dale, great to see you. And Hank, it's okay. Hank is I'm babysitting Hank, along with my other 2 dogs. So sorry that it's been like a kennel here today. Stay well. Have a good weekend. That's a nice way to end it.